So my summer goal for speaking was to relate both of my messages back to a clip from The Office. So success, you're welcome. If I completely bombed this morning, at least you got to watch a few minutes of The Office. So I know we met just a few minutes ago, but if you are new or you're a guest, my name's Hannah. I've been on staff for almost 3 years here at Narrate, and my title is Hospitality and Scattering Director. So this is not my normal role. I'm not the normal speaker. Usually on Sunday mornings, I'm in the back of the room, and I get to hang out in the lobby and in the back and make sure things run really smoothly back there. And then during the rest of the week, I plan our scattering events or our scattering projects where we're out in the community and serving people. But this morning, I'm here. I'm excited. I want to tell you a story. And I'm going to tell you a story about interruptions. Not the kind of interruptions we just saw on the clip from The Office, but I want to talk about God's interruptions and how God broke into my life in a very big way. So what some of you may know, I spoke a little bit about it last summer. Some of you may know that I've had the opportunity to travel to Kenya twice. Once in 2012, I went for 2 months, and then in 2014, I went back for 6 months. So some of you might know this, but what none of you know this, is that I didn't want to go. I never wanted to go. This was never in the plan. I had no interest in international missions. I had no interest in traveling to Kenya, Africa, just didn't have the desire. So how did I end up on these, not one, but 2 trips? In 2011, I was a college student at MSU in Bozeman, and I was part of a group called InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. And so it's a Christian group on college campuses very similar to Cru, Chi Alpha, Young Life, if you're familiar with any of those. And so each summer, staff from InterVarsity would take about 30 students to Kenya for this 2-month trip, and it was called the Kenya Global Project. And it's been happening for over 2 decades now. So in 2011, I had a few friends, about 5 other students from Bozeman, who went on this trip to Kenya. Now, I went to Costa Rica that summer like a normal college student and hung out on the beach and went zip lining. I didn't want to go serve people and take time out of my summer for 2 months. So we had our summers, we came back to school that fall, and I remember hearing all about their trip. I heard stories from the deep, intimate spiritual moments and connections that were made, the friendships that were formed, all the way to the classic traveling stories about weird food and bathroom issues and illnesses. I heard the range, this wide range of stories. And I remember thinking, that's great. That's good for you. I'm glad you went and had those experiences, but I'm never going to do that. That is too big, too scary. I have 0 interest. So one night, I was at one of our InterVarsity gatherings. We gathered every week, and it looked kind of similar to this. We would have someone speak, there'd be some music, and then we'd usually hang out afterwards. And so that night, the students who had gone to Kenya were speaking, and they were going to speak all about their experiences. And so I was sitting in the audience, and I'm listening to these stories. I've heard a lot of them before, and again, I'm thinking, that's great. Good for you. I'm so glad that you had this experience, but I'm never doing that. Again, it's too big, too scary, too unfamiliar. I have 0, good reason to go. So I'm sitting in the audience, and all of a sudden, I get this feeling, and I can't describe it. I get this overwhelming sense that I need to be on this trip next year. And I can't explain it. I was just sitting there, and I leave that evening going, I think I need to be on this trip next year. This is crazy. But I didn't really want to, so I forgot about it, and I went through that semester, and really quickly, I was home for Christmas break. So this is where the story gets kind of a little weird. I'm not going down a rabbit trail. I'm going to bring it all back around, so just hang with me. So I'm home for Christmas break in Glendive in the house I grew up in, and there was this desk in the side room of our house. And this desk was a place for my sister and I, as we were growing up, to shove all of our papers and like assignments and stuff that we wanted to keep, but we didn't know what to do with, so we like shoved them in this desk. Like, you know what I'm talking about. You all have a drawer or a closet or something like this. I think of it as like, okay, have you seen this Friends episode where Chandler finds Monica's closet and he like breaks into the closet and there's all her junk? That's this desk for my house. So during Christmas break, my mom keeps asking me, can you please clean out this desk? There's junk in there you don't want. And I don't want to clean on Christmas break. So I'm avoiding this whole thing. And finally one afternoon, she's like catches me. I'm not doing anything. So I'm like, fine, I'll clean out this desk. So I start going through papers and I found some notes. My sister and I, when we were little, we would write like little like random notes to each other. And so I'm finding some of these notes, and what I read on one of these notes that my sister wrote like over a decade ago in her little like block handwriting, you know how little kids write? This note makes me freeze. Like, I'm glad I was sitting down because I would have fallen over. This note, written by my sister over a decade ago, says this: Hannah, wouldn't it be so cool to go on a mission trip to Africa one day? And I'm like, I instantly remembered that feeling that I had gotten a few months before in that InterVarsity meeting. And I thought, this is totally a coincidence, a weird coincidence, but a coincidence nonetheless. So I finished doing my cleaning, and I thought, this is super weird. Like, it was still on my mind. I thought, I'm just going to watch some TV and forget about this whole thing. So I turned on the TV, and I'm not watching the TV for 5 minutes, and this is before Netflix, so there's commercials. And one of these commercials came on, and it was for, like, Compassion or World Vision, or an organization very similar. And this commercial is about sponsoring kids from different countries. And the first country they list, you can sponsor a child from Kenya. And I didn't finish watching the commercial. I shut off the TV, and I thought, another weird coincidence. It's getting a little freaky, but I'm never going, so it's not even an option. So I finished out my Christmas break. I went back to Bozeman to start a new semester. And about 2 weeks in, I had the weirdest day. I went to all my classes, and in every single class that day, Kenya came up in some random conversation or weird interaction. It was like this country was stalking me. Like, I couldn't get away from it. And I was studying psychology. So I wasn't even studying like geography or something slightly relevant. So I went back to my dorm room, and my roommate was there. And my roommate's here. She's never heard this story, so this will be good. So she's watching TV, and I'm sitting on my bed, and I'm going, oh my gosh, is this past the point of coincidence? Like, what is happening? And she's watching TV, and she's watching one of those shows that's like Real Housewives, Kardashian-esque type. You know the shows I'm talking about. It's like where these rich women complain about really insignificant problems. So she's watching one of these shows, and I hear Kenya coming from the TV. And I'm like, what the heck? So I turn, and I'm like, Margaret, is that woman's name Kenya? And she's like, yeah, it is. And she starts telling me about this show, but I'm not listening because I'm thinking about this stinking long application that I'm going to have to fill out to go on this trip. So that night, I grabbed my computer, I shut down the library, filling out this application, and 5 months later, I found myself on a plane to Kenya, still like not super happy that I was going on this trip. But I knew I was going for some reason, like something was going to happen. Like God had something planned for me, and I had no idea what was in store. This morning, I want to ask just a few questions. How is God attempting to interrupt our lives? Like, how is God attempting to break into our comfort zones, our routines, our schedules. Like, how is God trying to get our attention? And number 2, are we trusting in a God who is faithful to not only interrupt, but also to walk through those interruptions with us? So as I was preparing for this morning, I was looking in the text for some examples of God interrupting, and it's quite a theme throughout the text. So I had to whittle it down. I figured you didn't want to listen to 50 examples, so I whittled it down to just a few. And the first story I want to share with you is the story of Moses. So when I think of Moses, I think of a great leader, right? He led the Israelites out of slavery, out of Egypt. He led them through the wilderness for like 40 years. He received the 10 commandments from God to give to the Israelite people. Like, he was this great leader. He was God's go-to guy to get stuff done at this point. But what I really find interesting about his story is that he didn't want to go. Like, he argued with God and protested 5 different times in his story. So the story of Moses, in a nutshell, is this. Moses was born to an Israelite family in Egypt. And during this time, the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt. And Pharaoh sends out this message. And he thinks that the Israelites are getting too numerous. He's worried about them. And so he says, we're going to kill all of the Israelite boys. Well, Moses is born, and his mother isn't having this. And so she hides Moses, this little baby, for 3 months. I really want to know how she did this, because I'm not a parent, but I've heard babies are loud and cry a lot. So I really want to know how she managed to hide this baby for 3 whole months. And then she can't hide him anymore, so she puts him in a basket and sends him down the Nile River, hoping someone will find him. And who finds him but Pharaoh's daughter? So Pharaoh's daughter finds him, she takes compassion on Moses, and she raises him as her own. So Moses is raised in Pharaoh's household. So he grows up, and one day he's on a walk in the fields, and he sees something that sits really badly with him. He sees an Egyptian beating an Israelite slave. And this sits so badly with him that he actually kills the Egyptian. Pharaoh finds out, and Pharaoh's ticked, and so he wants Moses dead, so Moses just gets the heck out of there. He goes to another country, he meets some shepherds, he marries one of their daughters, they have a son, and for years, Moses lives this unassuming life as a shepherd, until one day God interrupts in a very huge way. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I'm going to check this out. This is weird. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. Moses is like, here I am. So God goes on to kind of introduce himself to Moses, and he explains that he sees the Israelites. They are still enslaved in Egypt. And he goes on to say, so God speaking to Moses, now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I've seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. Now go. I am sending you, Moses, to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. So this ensues this conversation, this back and forth between God and Moses. Moses throws every excuse in the book at God. He says, but who am I to go? Like, what if the Israelites don't believe me? The Egyptians are going to laugh in my face. I am not a good speaker. And then I feel bad for Moses. I was reading through this because his last attempt sounds so sad and desperate. I imagine him just going, please send someone else. Like, just get someone else to do this. But we know God doesn't. We know God encourages Moses. He said, I'm going to go with you. The Israelites are going to believe you. Pharaoh's a jerk, and I'm going to take care of him. And you know what? Your brother can go with you. And so we know the rest of the story, right? We know God uses Moses in a big way to save a nation, not only a nation, his nation, and lead them to the wilderness. But you know what I noticed as I was going through this story in preparation for today? I noticed something else. I noticed this very undramatic, unassuming interruption that happens right before Moses gets on scene. So if you remember, at this time, again, Pharaoh is bent on killing the Israelite baby boys, and so he approaches a few midwives. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, "When you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see the baby as a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live." The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what Pharaoh had told them to do. They let the boys live. I love this example because it is so unassuming and so undramatic. There's no voice from heaven or bush on fire. It is just God giving these women the quiet strength and courage to do what they know is right. It goes on. So Pharaoh's not a dummy. He notices there's some Israelites wandering around that shouldn't be. And he goes back to the midwives and he says, "Why have you done this? Like, why have you let the boys live?" And this is probably like the best verse in the Old Testament. This is hilarious. The midwives answered Pharaoh, "Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous, and they give birth before we even get there." So God was kind to the midwives. The people increased and became even more numerous. Now, this is speculation. I have no idea, but was Pharaoh totally that clueless? Maybe he was. I don't know. Or was this God's way of interrupting and protecting these women because he knew what they were doing was good and right? And then in the very next chapter, Moses enters the scene. So I love this example of God kind of interrupting in these big dramatic ways, or maybe in just small, quiet ways in these women's spirits. So our next example, as we plug along this morning, is in the book of Joshua. And it comes in the form of a woman named Rahab. Now, Rahab is alive during the time of the Israelites entering the promised land. So Moses has died, and Joshua is now the leader of the Israelites. And he leads the Israelites into the promised land that God has promised them. But it took them a while to get there. So there are some people groups there that they're going to need to fight off if they want to claim their land. So Joshua sends in a few spies to the nearby city of Jericho to kind of see what they're up against. And they take refuge in the home of a woman named Rahab. The king of Jericho was told, "Now look, some of the Israelite spies have come here tonight to spy out the land." So the king of Jericho sent this message to Rahab. He says, "Bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out this land." But the woman had taken the two men and hidden them. She said, "Yeah, these guys came to me, but I don't know where they came from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, they left. I don't know where they went. But if you go after them quickly, you might be able to catch up with them." However, she had taken them to the roof and hidden them under the stalks of flax she had laid out on the roof. So these men set out in pursuit of the spies on the road that leads to the fords of the Jordan, and as soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. So after this, Rahab goes upstairs and she's talking to these two Israelite spies, and she says, "Hey, I know the Lord has given you this land." And we're not told how she knows. I don't know how God communicated this with her, but she knows that this land is for the Israelites. And she says, "I'm going to help you, but I only ask for one thing in return. When you leave and come back with the Israelite army, spare me, spare the lives of myself and my family." And we know just this happens, right? She protects these men. They go back. Israel comes back and conquers them. And Rahab and the lives of her family are spared. But what she didn't know, what she could never know, is that one of her children would go on to have a child. And they keep having children until we get to King David. And then King David keeps having children and children until we get to Jesus. I love that God used a woman like Rahab in his story. Rahab had a few things going against her at this time in society. One, she was a Canaanite. She was not an Israelite. Number two, she was a prostitute, so she lived on the edges of her society. And number three, she was a woman, and we know women were treated as property and second-class citizens at this time. But I love that God uses her and includes her not only in his story, but in his ancestral lineage. Like, that's pretty cool. So our last example out of the text this morning comes to us. We're now cruising along. We're several centuries past Moses and Joshua's lives. We are now at a time where Paul and Silas are completing their ministry. This interruption comes in the form of a woman named Lydia. So Paul is on one of his short-term mission trips. He and his group of guys are going around. They are establishing new churches. They're praying for new Christians. Like, they're engaging believers. They're encouraging, mentoring disciples. It's a very exciting time in the early beginnings of the church. They end up in a place called Philippi, and they meet this woman named Lydia. Now, on the Sabbath, this is Paul speaking, on the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. "If you consider me a believer in the Lord," she said, "come and stay at my house," and she persuaded us. A couple of things we know about Lydia. She was a dealer in purple cloth. So at this time, purple was it was a long, arduous, expensive process to get something to be purple. And so because she was a dealer in purple cloth, we assume she was wealthy. She owned her own business. There's no mention of a husband. It's very clear she is the leader in her household. And I love this interruption because it starts with Lydia. It starts with one person. And it says, "The Lord opened her heart." And when he opened her heart, she was baptized. Her family members were baptized. And it doesn't say, but I can only speculate how these women around her were affected and influenced by her baptism. And then, because she shows great hospitality, she invites Paul and Silas to stay with them. And them staying with her gives them this foothold, or this into this region that they had not been ministering in before. And so them staying with Lydia really gives them kind of this opportunity to expand their ministry into Philippi and the surrounding regions. So again, I love that it starts with one person, and we can really see how God used this one person to begin to affect those around her. I chose these three examples because I love that God's story includes all sorts of people, and people from different times and different walks of life. I wonder if Lydia and Rahab weren't exact opposites. It seems like they were very different people. And so I love that there's room for all these different types of people in God's story. And even furthermore, I find it interesting, I wonder if we just have no idea the extent of the interruptions that God's placing in our lives. Did Lydia know? Could she have ever known that by herself being baptized and encouraging her family, did she know this would spread through to Paul and Silas's wider ministry? Did Rahab, she couldn't have known that eventually one of her ancestors would be Jesus? I just love how God uses, big Moses-like interruptions or very small, quiet interruptions to kind of push through to others. I love that. So I want to ask again, I'm just asking one question this morning. How is God attempting to interrupt your life? How is God attempting to break through to you? I really like this quote because I think sometimes, myself included, I get caught up in like the big Moses interruptions because they're exciting, they're fun to tell, but I really like this quote. It says, we don't live in a series of big dramatic moments. Like we don't careen from big decision to big decision. We all, man, I cannot read that. We all live in an endless series of little moments. The character of a life is set in 10,000 little moments of everyday lives. It is the themes of struggles that emerge from those little moments that reveal what's really going on in our hearts. So for me, Kenya was one of those big interruptions. Right? I didn't want to go. It was a big, time commitment. Financially, it was a big commitment. But God really used those 2 months. I felt like, and I didn't realize this until I was back home processing these 2 months, but I didn't realize how dependent I had become on my stuff, my relationships, all of these, comforts that I had come to trust in more than God. I didn't realize that that's what was happening until God kind of picked me up out of all of that and dropped me in this place where I felt like I had nothing, and I had to fully rely on Him just to make it through the day. But there's one story, there's one moment that stands out amongst the rest, and I'd like to share it with you this morning. So for these 2 months, you're all together with your team for the first week or so. And then for 3 weeks, you get partnered up and you're sent out all across Kenya to live with pastors and their families. And then after that, you come back together with your team for a few more weeks and debrief, and then you're sent back home. So for these 3 weeks, you could get sent to many exciting places. You could get sent to the coast. You could go up to the northern desert regions, these super rural villages. You could go hang out with a cool tribe like the Maasai or the Samburu. You could go to the shores of Lake Victoria, or you could get sent to one of the slums in Nairobi. And I thought, oh my goodness, okay, I don't want to be here, but I could go hang out with a cool tribe or go to the coast. I'll go anywhere, but I don't want to go to the slums. That sounds too hard, too scary, too rough. So for 3 weeks, I got sent to the slums just outside of Nairobi. Right. And I remember meeting the pastor, and there was one little glint of hope in the beginning. He handed my partner and I this printed, highlighted schedule of our 3 weeks. And I thought, this is my guy. Maybe it won't be so bad after all. So on the schedule, there was one day where we were supposed to go door to door, evangelizing and encouraging church members. And like a true introvert, I was like, oh my gosh, I hope I'm sick this day. This is not my thing. But I wasn't, and I had to do this. So we left that morning. It was myself and my partner and the pastor and then a few other church members. So we went out door to door, and our day basically looked like this. We would go to a home of someone in the church, and they would kind of tell us their situation, maybe share with us their testimony. We would take turns praying for them. We'd read maybe a passage out of the text if it felt appropriate, and then we'd take off. So we were doing these visits all day. And I was starting to get really tired. If you have ever been in an environment like a large slum, it's really draining. I describe it as an assault of your senses. Everything you're seeing just doesn't quite sit right with you. You're hearing a different language and different noises. The smells are beyond what I can describe. There's no formal sewage system, so a lot of the sewage is open on the sidewalks. There's garbage kind of right there too. There's kids playing in the garbage. So it's just this really draining, exhausting environment. And so we were coming to our last visit for the day. And we went into this home of a woman. And she started to tell us her story. And this story wasn't unlike so many we had heard that day. She was telling us she was married, but her husband was abusive. He was an alcoholic. He couldn't keep a job. And they had 5 kids. And so she begins to tell us about her 5 kiddos and the requests that she had. A few of them needed to be in school, but she couldn't afford to send all of them to school. So in Kenya, school costs money. There's no free schooling or free education. A few of these kiddos needed to see the doctor, but again, she didn't have the money. And so she had just enough finances to send 1, maybe 2 kiddos to be doing what they needed to do. And her request to us was which of her children should she spend her limited money on? And I remember thinking, my gosh, I have never in my life had such a desperate request. I looked at this woman and I remember thinking she couldn't have been much older than me. I was 21 at the time, and she really had to have been about my age. And I remember thinking, this is her life. This is her reality. I have a plane ticket out of here in a month, but this is her life. And I started to think about how blessed I've been. I've never had to worry about having a roof over my head, never had to worry about where my next meal was coming from. I was in college, I had great friends, a great network. I was born into a loving family. I'm so blessed. But my thinking began to shift a little bit. And I started to think something else. I thought, what did I do? What did I do to deserve this life I have? And I heard a voice. And this voice said 4 words that completely changed the trajectory of my life. This voice said to me, "You have done nothing." And you guys, in that woman's tiny 1-room shack in the heart of a slum in Nairobi, Kenya, I've never felt so small. I've never felt so humbled. But in that moment, I began to shift my thinking. I knew that I had been called to live a life bigger than myself. And I knew something else. I knew that I could never go back to school, never go back to Bozeman, and just slip right back into the life I had been living before. I knew that whatever I did with my life, whatever career path I chose, I knew that my life was going to be about pointing others toward Christ. Whew. So I began to process that moment, and I think a moment like that is something you really don't process and package and then put on a shelf in your mind. I think it's something that I'll be processing for the rest of my life. But in the year following this trip, I was doing some reading, and I came across this verse. And I grew up in the church, and being in university, I'd heard this verse so many times before, but when I read this verse, I realized it took on this whole new, tangible meaning to me. And I'd love to read it for you this morning. It says, "What actually took place is this. I tried keeping the rules and working my head off to please God, and it didn't work. So I quit being a lawman so I could be God's man. Christ's life showed me how and enabled me to do it. I identify myself completely with him. Indeed, I have been crucified with Christ. My ego is no longer central. It's no longer important that I appear righteous before you or have your good opinion, and I'm no longer driven to impress God. Christ lives in me. The life you see me living is not mine, but is a life lived by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. And I'm not going to go back on that. So I ask you this morning, I just want to leave you with one. Oh, no, I don't. I want to go through something else first. We're not quite done. I told myself I wouldn't get emotional as I was telling this story, but it's hard not to be affected still by that moment. I think God's interruptions, I believe that God uses these interruptions to shape us, to challenge us, to change us, and to bring a new awareness to God's presence in our everyday life. And I think God uses these massive, taking a 2-month trip, voice from heaven, burning bush. I think he uses these super dramatic interruptions, but I do believe that sometimes these interruptions are just a quiet strength or a quiet knowing in our spirit. And so I want to leave you with a question as we go today. I want to ask you, how is God attempting to interrupt your life? So I'm going to pray, and the band's going to play one last song, and we're going to sing our way out of here. God, thank you that you are a God who interrupts our lives. Thank you that you grab our attention in not only dramatic, but seemingly insignificant, tiny ways. God, thank you that you care enough to not only interrupt, but to walk through us and show us a fresh awareness of your presence in our everyday lives. God, I also quickly want to pray for firefighters and people affected by the fire in the North Hills. We just ask for safety in their work and be with those whose homes are in jeopardy. And God, just ask that you be over that situation today. In your name we pray. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.